Good morning. Thank you. I'm Rachelle Peterson, Policy Director at the National Association of Scholars. NAS is a national network of scholars and citizens who are defending intellectual freedom and the pursuit of truth as the purpose of higher education. And one of the movements that is pushing against that is the fossil fuel divestment movement. So we did a long report on what the fossil fuel divestment movement is, how it started on campus, what its goals are, and what it's teaching students, not only about the environment, but about the purpose of higher education. So I hope you have a copy of the executive summary of our report. If you didn't get one, they're on the table in the back of the room, as well as a few copies of the full report. Now, I'm going to tell you the story of the fossil fuel divestment movement and what it is doing on American college campuses. Well, I'll start with some good news. Last year, in May 2017, the Fossil Fuel Divestment Student Network, or the DSN, shut its doors. It closed down. It graduated its last class of DSN fellows, disbanded its staff, and ceased one of its core tenets of activism, tweeting. Its website, studentsdivest.org, closed down, and the domain name has since been bought by a Bitcoin enthusiast who advises how to make your fortunes on cryptocurrencies. Now, 5 years ago, when the Divestment Student Network was founded, fossil fuel divestment was well on its way to becoming the darling of the far left. The student organizers were profiled in the New York Times and on NPR. It collected endorsements from 4 academic departments, not just individual professors, but the entire departments, and even managed to hijack a public board meeting of the trustees. Having persuaded the board that meeting in private was undemocratic and elitist, the students then swarmed the room holding signs that read, "Check your ignorance." That's your with UR. They grabbed the mics and lectured board members for more than an hour about the need not only for fossil fuel divestment, but also for amnesty for illegal immigrants and the need for more racial diversity among the student body. College administrators are not known for their courage, but during that board meeting, Swarthmore's administration reached a new low. They canceled the agenda, and they sat silently while the students ranted. When another student in the audience, Danielle Charette, who was opposed to divestment and opposed to the hijacking of the board meeting, walked to the front of the room and asked President Rebecca Chop to intervene, Chop and all other administrators declined. They watched silently while the activists then turned on their fellow student, Charette, and yelled at her, "You are free to leave." Though Swarthmore College did not divest from fossil fuels, some 150 or so other colleges and universities did, or at least said they did. Many, if you scrutinized the fine print, signed pledges that were written in terms that signaled no actual change in the investment structure. I call these dinos, divestments in name only. But Swarthmore College did something else. It attempted to placate the student activists with pledges to go carbon neutral, devote more class time to teaching about global warming, and hire its first ever campus sustainability director. It also pledged to engage in shareholder activism. Swarthmore's decision is one that hundreds of colleges and universities have made. The decision not to divest, but instead to invest significant campus resources into perpetuating the machinery of global warming alarmism. That makes the death of the divestment student network and the decline in fossil fuel divestment fervor only a partial victory. American colleges and universities have largely held firm in their opposition to fossil fuel divestment, mostly out of concern for the financial losses that it would bring. In 2015, in my report for the National Association of Scholars, I scrutinized every single decision by a college or university for or against fossil fuel divestment. And 66% of those that declined to divest specifically cited the costs. Swarthmore's board chairman, Gil Kemp, calculated that Swarthmore might lose $10 to $15 million a year if it were to divest. About a third of the colleges and universities specifically cited the words fiduciary duty to raise funds for academic purposes and not to waste those funds on activism. A similar number of colleges cited the importance of donor intent and the fact that the donors who funded the endowment hadn't okayed using it for a political billboard. A handful of colleges did cite the necessity of using fossil fuels in our modern economy, and about a third acknowledged that divestment was a politically motivated campaign that was inappropriate for an institution of higher education. But, alarmingly, the single most popular reason that colleges gave in declining to divest was the claim that pulling out endowment investments from fossil fuel companies was futile. It did nothing to stop global warming, cut carbon dioxide emissions, force companies to change their business models, or institute a carbon tax. 79% said divestment was ineffective at its stated goals. And 59%, like Swarthmore, pledged to substitute other forms of environmental activism, either by teaching more classes about global warming or decreasing consumption of fossil fuel energy. In other words, colleges and universities rejected divestment not because they rejected the values and goals of the divestment movement, but because they disliked the tactic. They agreed with college and university students about the need for strict environmental regulations. They, too, wanted to abandon coal, oil, and gas companies, and they also believed that anthropogenic global warming was the single most important issue in today's society. They just didn't think divestment would accomplish those goals. That's why the shuttering of the divestment student network is not in itself cause to rest easy. The divestment movement is alarming, though, not only because it displays an astonishing indifference to economics, but also, more seriously, because it rejects a core tenet of the American representative democracy model, the idea that our political system is created with checks and balances in a structure that is set up to be fair and to balance competing interests. Now, that may sound like an overstatement, but it's not. The central premise of the fossil fuel divestment campaign is the idea that the political system is set up to favor the rich and well-connected at the expense of the environment. Not just that it has become corrupted and needs to be called back to its original principles. Not just that it has been misled and needs to be redirected, but the idea that having a democratic republic is in itself elitist and immoral and therefore worth protesting, obstructing, and hijacking in an effort to save the environment. That premise polarizes what should be a legitimate debate about how to treat the environment. It assumes that anyone who favors free markets is a mere mercenary, and it asserts that mob rule by street marching, live tweeting activists is better than free and civil debate. The fossil fuel divestment movement not only advocates a deeply flawed environmental policy, but worse, it trains a generation of students to disdain representative government and to replace a college education with 4 years of misguided activism. Perhaps it is no surprise then that the DSN staff have regrouped recently, and they've started a new organization called the Sunrise Movement, which recruits and trains openly socialist candidates for office. One of their endorsees, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, won a congressional primary in New York City, beating out a 10-term incumbent and the number 4 ranked House Democrat. She has vowed to support a Green New Deal and 100% renewable energy. So, we should celebrate the demise of the fossil fuel divestment student network, but we should not think our work is done. Thank you.